Hey, morning, guys. Hope you had a good break. Um, this is our first day back after break, and when we left, we had been looking at um, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And what's happened in the last couple of weeks, a lot of things have come down that really illustrate the things that we've been talking about in this. Oh, bit my tongue. Sorry. In this unit here. Okay. So remember, we talked about aggregate supply and aggregate demand being the economic model that Keynes developed for the purpose of explaining short run uh, movements in the economy. Okay. Business cycles, recessions, recoveries. Okay. Why does it happen? And so we saw, and you can go back and look, aggregate supply and aggregate demand um, in the long run are controlled. In the long run, aggregate supply is controlled by um, uh, factors of production. And in the short run, however, monetary policy can have an impact on um, short run aggregate supply. So we end up with a graph that looks like this. We've got long run aggregate supply is a vertical, okay, because it doesn't change a lot. It's based on factors of production. Then we've got aggregate demand, okay, aggregate demand here, all right, and then short run aggregate supply. And prices and output are the axes. All right. So you got short run aggregate supply, and you've got long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, short run aggregate supply is just a matter of time horizon. Okay. They are different because short run aggregate supply is in a shorter run, it can be affected by nominal variables, especially the money supply. So, Keynes's basic idea was anytime you have um, a recession, it's normally the result of a reduction in aggregate demand. So, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left in this case. So aggregate demand here, the aggregate demand curve here, okay, and it is to the left. What has happened? In that case, output goes down, prices go down. Now, let's talk about what's happening in the US right now. What's happened initially is we had what's called a supply shock. So initially, the first movement was short run aggregate supply. We got a supply shock because we are very dependent on China. So as a result, short run aggregate supply shifted to the left. Okay, short run aggregate supply shifted left. But subsequent to that, now we've got everybody. Now that the coronavirus has hit the United States, people have to stay home. So nobody's traveling. Most of us didn't go on spring break. I don't know of anybody who did. Okay, so that hammered the tourism industry. Um, Restaurants. People aren't going to restaurants. So that hurts people who work at restaurants. Hotels, they're being hurt. Airlines are hurt. Um, Gasoline sales are down. Why? Everybody's staying home. And we're starting to see more and more people laid off of work. So, as a result, the aggregate demand curve has also shifted to the left. We are in recession. We're at the front end of a recession. And the only issue is how long is this going to last at this point, and how severe will it become? Well, in response to that, um, we've seen a couple different things happen. We've seen monetary and fiscal policy applied to try to alleviate or ameliorate the impact of the leftward shift of aggregate demand and the leftward shift of short run aggregate supply. We're trying to stabilize those and bring them back to the um, where they would be in the long run. And this has been a couple different things. Monetary policy is handled by the Fed, the Federal Reserve. And in the short run, these kind of policies can work. The question is, how do you define short run? We saw this with the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, the Fed, under the leadership of Paul Bernanke, did some things where they kept increasing the money supply by buying up bonds from bond holders. Remember, think back all the way when we talked about the money supply. If the Fed wants to increase the money supply, they buy up bonds. If they want to decrease the money supply, they sell bonds. So during the Great Recession, they bought up bonds. This happened 3 times. It was called quantitative easing, and they called it QE1, QE2, and QE3. Well, what did the Fed say they were going to start doing last week? They're going to start buying up bonds. The Fed also said that they would reduce interest rates to try and encourage more investment and spending and push the I of SIGNIX. In the case of buying up bonds to increase the money supply, what you're trying to do is put money in the hands of people so they'll spend it. So you're pushing the C of SIGNIX. So that's monetary policy. The other thing that we can see is fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy takes on there are a couple different things that happen with fiscal policy. One is you can increase government spending. So we've seen this in the past couple weeks. What's happened? President Trump and Congress have rolled out a couple different things. One, they're going to send money out to people. They're just going to cut a check, $1,200 to each adult in a home where income is less than it's either $130,000 or $135,000. Why? So that people have money to spend, especially if they've been laid off of work as a result of this coronavirus recession. The other thing, a couple of other things that they're doing is they're giving bailouts or money to help support tourism-based industries like the airlines and hotels. Okay, now what kind of impact does that have? In both cases, what matters, and we looked at this just before the break, is the multiplier effect. Remember, each dollar, so if somebody gets that $1,200 check, what are they going to do with it? Well, the idea is we want them to spend it. How much of it are they going to spend? Well, that depends. And each time they spend it. So they go to the grocery store and they buy a can of beans. Now the grocer has that money. What does the grocer do? The grocer uses that money to buy more cans of beans. Now the bean producer, or let's say corn or ketchup, because we can send it right up to Red Gold up the road there outside of Alexandria. So now Red Gold has that, and they're going to use that to pay a worker. What's the worker going to do with that? They're going to spend it. At each point, that dollar that was initially sent out is becoming multiplied. And how much is it multiplied? Well, it depends on something called the marginal propensity to consume. We looked at this before break also. Okay, the idea is and you've worked problems with that. And I'll give you a couple more today. The idea is that if you have a dollar, you're not going to spend it all. So if you're going to spend 80 cents of that dollar, your marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. How does that impact the dollar? Well, 1 over 1 minus the MPC, we take that and we multiply that. So that's our formula, remember? Okay, that's our formula. So if I take 0.8 there, so I got 1 over 0.2, okay? My multiplier now, my multiplier is going to end up being whatever that is if I divide it, okay? I want to say it's 8, okay? I'm sorry. Yeah, you do the math. Okay, then I multiply that by however much I'm dumping in. So we've had $3 trillion if dumped in. If the MPC was 75%, we'd end up with a multiplier of 4. So the idea would be that we're going to end up having not $12 million or $3 trillion, but 12 pumped in. Now, that can be offset by something called the crowding out effect. Okay, a couple different things involved here. One, I think when you're in a situation like this, people's marginal propensity to consume is going to go down. The other thing that you'll see is crowding out. That works in the opposite direction. If we increase government purchases, that's going to raise income, which shifts the demand for the money to the right. It's going to raise interest rates, and that's going to lower investment. So we're pushing the C, but we're lowering the I. So the aggregate demand may not shift as far to the right as a result of the increase in government purchases, okay? The other thing that the government can do, and President Trump has said they're going to do, is reduce taxes. That's the other fiscal policy. If you reduce taxes, then people have more money in their check and they take that home. Okay? Most economists agree that these are steps that are necessary and should be done by the government in order to help out the economy and reduce the impact of the recession. Next time, we're going to talk about the chapter 35. So what we just did was a quick review of 34. I'm going to give you some problems to work on with that. We're going to talk about the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, because as you push the aggregate demand back to the right, what happens? Prices go up. What's the correlation between inflation and unemployment? Historically, the correlation has been if you have low levels of unemployment, you're going to end up with higher levels of inflation and vice versa. Well, for the past 5 years, that's not been the case. We've had low levels of unemployment and low inflation. So it was kind of an anomaly. Okay, we're going to talk about that next time. Stay warm, stay safe. I'll talk to you later. Make sure you do the little quiz that I have on here, okay?